the Jamstack, JavaScript, APIs, and markup, or just a modern stack. The Jamstack is a present-day way of looking at modern development. But this does not mean that some tried, tested, but slightly older platforms such as WordPress cannot be part of this new workflow. Here to have this discussion with Jamstack-ify WordPress with 11T is our good friend Kellen. Enjoy.
Cool. So yeah, let's dive into it. I am here to talk about Jamstack-ifying WordPress with 11D. Henry, thank you so much for hosting today, and everybody, I hope you're enjoying 11Ds, and I'm looking forward to doing this talk with you. So in this talk, we'll cover like why would you consider this pairing of like using WordPress as a headless CMS and pairing it with 11D, because WordPress can do its own templating already. Like what kind of features can we unlock if we choose to have this decoupled approach and pair it with 11D. And I won't be doing live coding, because you can find a lot of examples out there on the web of how to fetch data from WordPress in like JavaScript files and then inject that into your 11D templates. I thought I could provide the most value in this talk by talking about the pros and cons and so on of doing this approach and why you might want to consider it. My name is Kellen Mace. As Henry said, I'm a senior staff developer advocate at WP Engine, which is one of the largest WordPress-specific web hosts out there. And my Twitter handle is there. If you're interested at all in headless WordPress stuff and pairing it with modern JavaScript front ends and things like that, I tweet a lot about that kind of thing. So with that, we'll dive in here. Let's first ask the question. Why WordPress, right? It's not exactly the newest, hottest technology out there. So why are we talking about it today? The fact is, WordPress is the most popular CMS that's out there. At this point, the statistic is it is powering more than 40% of the web, which is just a staggering statistic if you think about it. It's trusted and well-known CMS, and it provides the editorial workflows and content creation experience that a lot of users like really love. Those of you who work in the web space, I'm sure you've heard this before. People just requesting WordPress because they, it's just a known and loved CMS at this point. So historically, you would use WordPress as a traditional monolithic CMS, and when you do that, WordPress has a lot of jobs. It has this job of interacting with the database. So it saves data to the database and pulls it out and so on. It provides the whole admin interface. This is where your content creators, can log in to create or update content. And it also serves the HTML pages to end users when pages are requested, among other jobs. So it does, quite a bit. And it's done that job well for a long time. WordPress has provided a lot of value for a lot of folks, and you can even get pretty darn good performance out of it if you turn on features like full page caching. There are plugins for WordPress that you can use, or web hosts you can use that do that, where they'll render the HTML once and then cache that as a static HTML file that can be distributed across a CDN and served up very quickly to users, right? And having a collection of static HTML files on a CDN ready to be served up sounds a lot like 11D, right? So what are we missing here? Why would we want to consider decoupling our front end and have that handled by 11D? So we'll consider that alternative approach and what benefits that might unlock next here. All right, so as I mentioned, the other approach then, instead of using WordPress as kind of an integrated or monolithic CMS, is to decouple it. So it looks something like this, where you would have WordPress, and it would still do some of its jobs, like saving and fetching things from the database and providing the nice content creation experience, but it no longer would render the sites to end users. Instead, we would use an API layer, something like the WP GraphQL plugin, or otherwise WordPress has a REST API. You can use one of those to pull data out of WordPress and then use that in 11D, and that data then you could pipe into your templates and use it to generate all of your pages. So that would be a decoupled approach or a Jamstack approach, to use that buzzword. Now let's talk about, okay, I understand the difference here, but why? Why would we choose to go for this decoupled approach? What does it bring to the table? The first big reason I have for you is working with multiple data sources. And you'll see this cited as a common example for why Jamstack, a Jamstack approach is really rising in popularity on the web. Is this reason? No longer gone are the days where there's just like a single CMS and 100% of the website's data comes solely from that CMS. These days we're seeing all kinds of services spring up for handling your authentication and your image hosting and your, media files and so on, or headless CMSs, and you're wanting to query multiple sources of data and stitch all of that, data together at build time to build out your pages. So an example would be, I have a few examples here, on this slide. So let's say for my app, I have like my blog posts in WordPress. My marketing team, likes to author all of their content there. So that's where that lives. I also have documentation pages on my website, and those are all written in Markdown, and those live in my GitHub repo. And then lastly, we have several pages on the site where we sell products. So those e-commerce pages, they source their data from Shopify, right? So if you ask yourself, how would I build something like this using WordPress as a traditional monolithic CMS? It can be done, but in my experience, it would be, difficult and cumbersome to do that. When a request comes into the WordPress backend, it doesn't have all the data it needs in the database. It has to source some of it from Shopify, and then you have to figure out how you're going to, take the Markdown files and convert those into HTML that can be ultimately be, rendered into your pages. And it gets kind of complex and unwieldy doing it that way. If you instead go with this decoupled architecture and a Jamstack kind of architecture, this kind of thing becomes much easier. You can just have multiple sources, and then when a build happens, pull your data from each of those and render out your pages with the data from all of these sources. So that's a huge one that I see folks choosing this kind of architecture for. Another one is multiple clients. So if you're using WordPress or any CMS as a monolith, what you're really saying is, I'm only going to have one client, and it's the web, right? My website is going to receive requests and return HTML only. I've seen and worked with many folks in the community though who say, yeah, we have a web client, and then early next year or whatever, we're going to also be launching a mobile app, so iOS and Android apps. And we want those, clients, the mobile clients, to be able to source their data from the same WordPress backend that the web client does, right? So how do you handle that? It ends up being like a never-ending game of like playing catch up if you're using WordPress as a monolith. Let me explain what I mean by that. So let's say you have WordPress and you're using it to serve up HTML to your web client, but now you have these mobile, clients that need to be able to pull out JSON data. So you make a bunch of changes to expose the data, as JSON to those clients, and now changes are needed. They're adding business requirements change, and we're adding new post types or taxonomies in WordPress, and we need to change the HTML being output to the web client. But now that's not enough because our mobile clients need that same data. So now we have to do this work of, updating the GraphQL or REST API schema to serve our mobile apps. And it becomes this kind of, game of always keeping one in sync with the other. If you instead go for a decoupled or Jamstack approach, where your web client, mobile clients, desktop client, whatever you're dealing with, if all of them source their data from the same WordPress backend and do so in the same way, like using the WP GraphQL or the REST API schema, things become a lot more consistent. Any changes you make to that schema and the data that it provides, it just flows down to all of the clients that may need to consume that. So this is another big one that I see in my role, working closely with folks who are choosing WordPress as a headless CMS and going for the decoupled approach. Another benefit you get by choosing 11D, of course, is the templating languages. There's just a ton of them that are supported, of course. If you use traditional WordPress, then all you get is its theme API. It's the PHP based templating that WordPress has. Otherwise, if you go for the decoupled approach, then Bob's your uncle, right? You can choose any of these template languages and just whatever your team prefers. Another great one is atomic deploys. So you could make it so that if you, in my example where you have markdown files, Shopify products, and WordPress blog posts, you could do something like this, where deploys happen when there are changes to markdown files in your Git repo, or when there are changes to products in Shopify and a webhook is fired off, or when there are changes to blog posts in WordPress and a webhook is fired off from there to trigger a new build. And I have shown here is a plugin that I've really had good luck with using in the past for this exact purpose. This Jamstack deployments WordPress plugin makes it nearly effortless to just install this, give it what webhook endpoint it should send a request to, and then just tell it when to fire off a request. You could tell it when posts change or pages change or users change or any of your other content on the on the site is just like simple check boxes, and it just handles deployments for you. So it becomes very easy to manage. All right, so I've praised this quite a bit and talked about a lot of benefits from that you might get if you choose this decoupled or Jamstack architecture. But like any decision in tech, it comes with some trade-offs, right, that you might want to consider. So I have them listed here. The first is WordPress themes, right? Obviously, if we're decoupling this so that our front end rendering of pages is no longer handled by WordPress, but is now handled by Eleventy, WordPress themes obviously wouldn't work anymore. So if the client you're working with or whatever has some expectation that they're going to be able to use those, pick their favorite WordPress theme, you need to know that going in that you're choosing this different method for rendering the front end. And likewise, WordPress plugins that add visual elements to the page. WordPress has a long history of many plugins in the plugin directory where you can just plop in like an image slider, galleries, things like that, and just add visual elements to the pages yourself, even if you're not a coder or somebody who's technical. So a lot of plugins would still work in WordPress. The ones that change what data gets stored where, like the popular advanced custom fields plugin, if anybody on the call is familiar with the WordPress space, all of those would still work since they affect the WordPress backend and the data it stores. But any that affect the visual elements that show up on the page, those couldn't be used, right? And you could cite that as a negative, but also think of it as a positive. If you want the site kind of locked down so that the only visual changes made to it are the ones that are like intended and pushed by the development team, instead of people willy-nilly adding their own visual elements to the page, this could actually be viewed as a positive thing as well. And last one is some other things that you get for free with monolithic WordPress, things like post previews, authentication, and doing form submissions. That's a bit easier when your front end and your back end are one and the same when it's a monolith. And when you do the decoupled approach, a few of those things you have to reinvent the wheel and re-implement some of those features. So that'd be another thing to consider if you're thinking about going this route. All right, so with all that said, we'll close things out. So hopefully this talk gave you a good sense of like when it might make sense to do this. Like I said at the outset, you might think like, well, WordPress already has its theme API and it can already produce templates, and you can even cache those static HTML pages and distribute them across a CDN. So why would I do the same thing somewhere else using a static site generator like Eleventy? So hopefully this talk was helpful for answering that question. When you need to support multiple data sources or support multiple clients, I think a strong argument can be made for doing this kind of Jamstack architecture and using something like Eleventy for that front end and building out your pages. So that's all I had for you. Thank you so much for tuning in. Again, I'm available like on Twitter if anybody has any questions about this stuff or wants to reach out. Happy to talk with you.